Hi everyone, it's Kathy for Not Too Shabby Shop. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'll be creating a card using the Warm and Cozy stamp set from Not Too Shabby. I started out with a piece of Neenah Desert Storm cardstock, and currently it's cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, but I do end up cutting that down with a rectangle die later on. I started out by arranging a couple of the stamps from the stamp set onto an acrylic block and decided to do some heat embossing. So I randomly stamped the images onto the Desert Storm cardstock with VersaMark ink, and I did treat my cardstock really well with my anti-static powder tool to make sure that the embossing powder stayed only where I wanted it to, which is of course on the VersaMark ink. So after I had all those little images stamped out, I did coat my cardstock with detail white embossing powder, and then I shook off the excess embossing powder and cleaned up a couple of spots here and there, and then I heat set it with my heat tool. I did have my heat gun heating up off to the side for, probably 30 seconds or so, just to make sure that it was nice and hot. That helps to get the powder to melt a little bit faster, and it also helps with keeping your cardstock from warping as you're doing the heat setting. After I had that heat set, I let it cool off for just a little bit before I actually started my coloring. And I kept the coloring really very simple, and I'm only going to show you how I colored one of each of the images. For the gingerbread man, I used one color, which is E25. One thing about coloring embossed images with Copics is that the Copic markers can stain the embossing powder, particularly if you use white. So one way to clean that up is to very quickly with a colorless blender go over the embossing powder that you got the Copic ink on, and it will lift it right off. You do want to clean off the nib of your Copic onto a piece of scratch paper though, because you can end up just spreading the ink from the Copic marker all over the place. For the little gingerbread man's cheeks, I used R32, and for the heart on top of his head, I used R27 and R24. For the little solid hearts, I started with R59 and added that at the very bottom and up around the sides, but I didn't go all the way up to the bumps on the top of the heart. After the R59, I used R27 and filled in most of the heart, and then I blended it all together with R24. For the peppermint candy ornaments, I started out with R59 and just did a tiny little bit at the bottom of every other spiral. I guess it's a spiral. And then I came in with R27 and went a little bit further up and left a tiny little area up at the very top, and I blended it all together again with the R24. For the white part on the peppermint ornaments, I just colored that in with a white colored pencil. Moving on to the cup of cocoa, I started with coloring in the bow first, and I started with G09 and added that in the areas where it would be the darkest, where a shadow would be cast on the ribbon. So around the bells, and then where the bow of the ribbon is hanging over the tail of the ribbon. Next, I came in with G05 and added just a little bit, but I left quite a bit of white space for my highlight color, which is, well, it starts out being YG03, but you'll see in a moment here that I'm going to come back in and do another coat of color, and I'm also going to bring in an even darker color. I was not getting the contrast that I wanted to, especially after I blended over with the YG03. So after I was done with the YG03, I brought in G28, and I added that basically in the same areas that I added the G09 when I first started. So at the very outer edges of the bow part of the ribbon, and then underneath the bells, because the bells would be casting a shadow, and then on the inside of the open part of the bow, I don't know how to explain that, I did add a little bit there. I blended that out again with the G09, and then I finished up with another coat of the G05. And the highlights still stayed there from the YG03, they just weren't quite as bright, and I was actually much happier with this. It seemed to give it more of a true Christmas green color to me. Anyway, moving on to the little bells, I started with Y26 and I colored in the inside of the bells where the little openings are with that, and then did a little bit around the edge. And then I just filled in the rest with Y19. For the mug itself, I started with R29 and I added that in the areas where there would be shadows. So the bow and the bells would be casting a shadow on the handle and the mug, and then the lip of the mug would be casting a shadow on the body of the mug. I did a little bit of an outline around the edges so that when I did the blending, I was able to make it hold that round shape. After I was done with the R29, I came in with the R27 and added a little bit more of that, and you'll see that on the rim I left a white space right next to the bow, and that's just so that I could have a highlight there. And I filled in most of the mug with the R27. After the R27, I finished up with R24 and filled in all of the white spaces that I had left previously. And to get even more contrast, to have deeper shadows, I cheated just a little bit and I brought in R59 and added that very sparingly in the areas where it would be the darkest. So under the bell on the handle, and then there's a little kink in the handle where you can see where it's drawn in, so that told me that a shadow would be there as well. And I added a little bit around the ribbon as well. After I had the R59 added in, I came in with R14, and I think I was saying that my lightest color was R24, and that's not true. As a matter of fact, I think all my colors are incorrect. Anyway, I'll make sure to have all of the colors that I did use listed in the description box below. But a quick rundown for the reds, I started with R27, then I went to R24, and then R14. Then I came in with the R59, blended that out with the R14, and then blended that out again with the R27. So now that I got all my reds straight, we'll move on to the cocoa. You can see just a tiny little bit of cocoa in the mug, so for that I just used the E25. To color in the marshmallows, and there is an abundance of them, which is exactly how I like my cocoa, I started with N3 and I added that in the areas on the marshmallows that are behind another marshmallow, because the marshmallow in front, again, would be adding a shadow on the marshmallow that is behind it. After the N3, I came in with N2 and added a tiny little bit of that, and then I blended those out with N0, and I did leave a tiny little bit of white space at the top of each marshmallow, and then I came in with my colorless blender and blended all of it together. I know that when I'm done coloring that the marshmallows look a little bit gray, but once the ink has had a chance to settle in and blend within the fibers of the cardstock, they will look white, especially after I'm done putting the whole card together. So after I had finished all of the coloring, I did fussy cut the little cup of cocoa, and off camera I did stamp, emboss, and color in another little gingerbread man, and I also fussy cut him. But to put my card together, I had used a stitched rectangle die and cut down my background paper. And when I was playing around with the layout off camera, the background was a little bit too bold. It was taking away from the focal image. So a quick fix for that is to add a layer of vellum on the front of your card. To make sure that my adhesive wasn't sticking out all over the place, I just folded about maybe half an inch of the vellum over the top part of my background panel and adhered it to the back. And then I put a little bit of adhesive on the images at the bottom, and you can't even see the adhesive once it's all put together. And then I adhered my background panel to the front of a top folding A2 sized red note card. And I had also die cut a Desert Storm circle using a stitched circle die, and then a red circle using a regular red circle die. Adhered those together and put those on the front of the card. I used a little bit of my tape runner just to hold my gingerbread man in place where I wanted to have him in front of the cup of cocoa. And of course I added a bunch of foam tape to the back of those two images and then added them to the front of the card. To finish it up, I did use my Wink of Stella glitter pen and added a little bit of shimmer to the heart on my gingerbread man and the jingle bells on my cup of cocoa. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.